At 0755 on December 7, 1941, Mess Attendant 2nd Class Doris Miller was in the laundry compartment of the USS West Virginia, folding crisp white officer uniforms 3 decks below the morning sunlight, when he heard a blast that would alter his life and eventually leave a lasting mark on the United States Navy. Miller, 22, hailed from Waco, Texas. He had enlisted in the Navy in September 1939 because the pay was reliable and his family required financial support. The Navy offered him only one position: mess attendant, cook, dishwasher, laundry worker. In 1941, black sailors were barred from combat roles. They received no weapons training. They were not assigned to gun stations or combat posts. Navy rules were explicit: mess attendants served meals, maintained officers' quarters, and stayed out of the way during battle. Miller had been aboard the West Virginia for 16 months. He knew the ship thoroughly. He knew the location of every officer's bunk. He knew who wanted coffee at 0600 and who slept until 0700. He memorized the laundry routine. Every Sunday at 7:30, he collected soiled uniforms. That December 7th morning, he was exactly on schedule. The laundry room reeked of soap and steam. The air hung heavy with moisture. Miller had just completed folding a stack of khaki shirts when the first torpedo struck. The explosion slammed him against the bulkhead. The lights flickered. The deck shifted beneath him. He heard shouting from above, rapid footsteps, alarms blaring. He dropped the laundry and sprinted toward his designated battle station, an anti-aircraft magazine amidships. Miller knew its location perfectly, having drilled on it countless times. Get to your station, remain at your station, perform your duties. Corridors filled with sailors running in every direction, some heading to stations, others aiding injured men. Emergency lights cast a dim red glow. He could hear water rushing somewhere below, like an indoor waterfall. When he arrived at the magazine, he found twisted metal and seawater. A Japanese torpedo had ripped a hole through the port side, precisely where his battle station should have been. The space was flooding. Water poured through a 20-foot breach in the hull, daylight visible through the gap, harbor water beyond. The torpedo had struck at 0758. The Type 91 torpedo contained 450 kilograms of explosives. The detonation tore through the ship's armor belt, opening interior compartments to the sea. Miller froze for several seconds, trying to comprehend the destruction. Sailors struggled to close watertight doors and hatches to limit flooding. Damage control teams were already active, men running with hoses, emergency gear, and lights. Then another blast shook the vessel. A second torpedo had hit further forward. The ship shuddered. More alarms, more shouting. The deck tilted sharply. Miller felt the West Virginia listing to port. Within minutes, 5 torpedoes had struck her portside. Each created a new breach, each let in thousands of gallons of seawater per minute. The ship leaned dangerously. If the flooding continued, the West Virginia risked capsizing like the Oklahoma. Miller ran toward the main deck. When he reached the surface, he saw pandemonium. Japanese aircraft filled the sky. Dive bombers screamed downward. Torpedo bombers skimmed the harbor. Fighters strafed the decks with machine guns. Smoke rose from ships along Battleship Row. The USS Arizona burned. The USS Oklahoma was overturning. Fires spread. Sailors leaped into the water. Oil slicks from damaged hulls ignited. Gunfire and explosions echoed. The smell hit him: burning oil, cordite, heated metal. Smoke stung his lungs. Heat radiated from below decks. An officer grabbed him, yelling over the chaos. The captain was wounded and needed help. Miller followed the officer to the bridge. Captain Bin Sharban, 54, had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1910, ranking 3rd in his class. He had commanded the West Virginia since June 1941, only 6 months. Experienced and respected, he had served on battleships for most of his career, mastering gunnery, damage control, and ship handling. He had trained his crew intensively. They were skilled. They were prepared. Yet nothing could have readied them for that morning. On the bridge, Ben Yen lay near the starboard side. A bomb had hit the USS Tennessee, moored alongside the West Virginia. The bomb, a modified 16-inch armor-piercing naval shell fitted with fins for aerial release, had penetrated Tennessee's armor and exploded. Shrapnel flew everywhere. The two ships were so close that fragments reached West Virginia's bridge. One shard, about 6 inches long and irregularly shaped, tore through Benayan's abdomen, likely striking his spine. The injury was catastrophic. Internal organs were exposed. Blood pooled, dark red, almost black, mixing with seawater and oil. A pharmacist's mate applied a field dressing, but the captain was dying. The bandage was soaked. Blood seeped through the edges. Ben Yen remained conscious, issuing orders, counter-flooding to prevent capsizing, fire suppression, damage control assignments. His voice stayed steady despite the agony. Miller and another sailor tried to move him, but he refused. He had to command the ship. Miller saw the captain's hands tremble, pressing against the wound to hold it closed. Blood soaked through. Orders continued. An officer redirected Miller to the anti-aircraft guns on the port side to pass ammunition. Miller ran to the gun mount and saw the unexpected. The crew had been killed by Japanese strafing fire. Their bodies slumped around a still-functional Browning .50 caliber machine gun, water-cooled and belt-fed on a pedestal. Miller had never trained on it. Regulations forbade mess attendants from firing guns, but the weapon was loaded and ready. Japanese planes dove toward the ship. Nobody else was available to man it. Miller made a decision that violated every regulation in the Navy manual. He grabbed the gun handles and started firing. The Browning .50 caliber weighed 121 pounds without its mount. It fired 550 rounds per minute. The ammunition came in belts stored in metal boxes. The gun had twin water hoses running to the barrel jacket to keep it cool during sustained fire. Each belt held 200 rounds. The ammunition was a mix of armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds. Every fifth round was a tracer, leaving a visible streak so the gunner could see where his fire was going. Miller had watched gun crews during training exercises. He had seen them load, aim, and fire. He understood the basic mechanics. Point at the target, pull the trigger, keep the barrel on the aircraft, compensate for lead. The gun kicked hard when he fired. The recoil pulsed through the mount into the deck. The noise was deafening, even with the sounds of explosions and aircraft engines all around. The Browning's rapid fire dominated his immediate soundscape. Spent cartridges ejected to the right side, clattering onto the deck. Brass casings bounced and rolled with each burst. The smell of burned powder filled his nose. Cordite and gun oil mixed with the smoke from fires burning across the harbor. Miller could feel the vibration through his hands and arms. The gun was alive, bucking and roaring under his control. He aimed at a Japanese dive bomber that was pulling up after releasing its bombs. The aircraft was an HD-3A, what the Allies would later call a VAL. It had just dropped its payload on the Tennessee and was climbing away at about 200 miles per hour. Miller pressed the trigger and held it down. Tracers reached out toward the aircraft in a stream of fire. Some rounds missed, arcing past the bomber into the sky. Some hit. He saw sparks along the bomber's fuselage where armor-piercing rounds struck metal. The plane kept flying. The damage was not enough to bring it down. He shifted his aim to another aircraft, a torpedo bomber was coming in low over the water heading straight for Battleship Row. It was a Nakajima B-5N, a Kaiden Allied designation. The bomber was maybe 50 feet above the harbor surface, its torpedo visible beneath the fuselage. Miller led the target, aiming ahead of the aircraft's nose. He needed to put his bullets where the plane was going to be, not where it was now. He fired another burst. This time he saw pieces fly off the aircraft's wing. Control surface fragments tumbled away. The bomber wavered, its flight path disrupted, but the pilot maintained control and continued the attack run. The torpedo dropped. Miller lost sight of it in the chaos. He did not know if it hit anything. There was too much happening too fast to track individual attacks. Miller kept firing for approximately 15 minutes. Miller manned that gun. He fired at every Japanese aircraft that came within range. He went through multiple ammunition belts. The water in the cooling jacket started to steam. The gun handles grew hot despite the water cooling. His shoulders ached from the recoil. His ears were ringing from the noise. He kept firing until an officer ordered him to stop. The gun was out of ammunition. The ship was sinking. Everyone needed to abandon ship. Miller ran to help move wounded sailors to the main deck. West Virginia was settling deeper into the harbor. Water was rising through the lower decks. Fires were spreading despite the counter-flooding. The list to port had stabilized, but the ship was clearly going down. Miller helped carry injured men up ladders, through passageways filled with smoke, past fires, and flooded compartments. The deck was slick with oil and blood. His hands were burned from touching hot metal. His uniform was soaked with cedar and other men's blood. He could barely hear anything except a constant ringing in his ears. Captain Beenan was still on the bridge when Miller passed by. The captain was still giving orders. His voice was weaker now. Miller could see the blood loss was taking its toll. Beenan died on the bridge sometime before 0900 hours. He refused to leave his post. He commanded his ship until he physically could not speak anymore. The Navy would later award him the Medal of Trip Honor posthumously. Miller was one of the last men to leave the West Virginia. The ship had taken 7 torpedoes and 2 bombs. Over 100 of her crew were dead. Many more were wounded. The battleship settled onto the harbor bottom with her superstructure still above water. Fires continued to burn for hours. Some men were trapped below deck in sealed compartments. They would die there over the next several days as their air ran out. Miller swam through oil-covered water to reach safety. The oil was burning in some places. He had to navigate between patches of fire floating on the surface. Japanese aircraft were still overhead, though the attack was winding down. The entire engagement had lasted approximately 1 hour and 50 minutes. By 09:55, the Japanese aircraft were gone. What remained was destruction on a scale Miller had never imagined possible. 8 battleships were damaged or sunk. 3 cruisers damaged. 3 destroyer damaged. 188 aircraft destroyed. 243 Americans dead. Another 1,178 wounded. The United States Pacific Fleet had been crippled in a single morning. Miller went to sick bay. Medics checked him for injuries. He had burns on his hands from the gun handles and hot metal. His hearing was damaged from the sustained gunfire without ear protection. He had bruises and cuts from being thrown around during the explosions. Nothing life-threatening. He was sent to a temporary barracks facility while the Navy sorted out what to do with survivors from the damaged ships. Nobody asked Miller what he had done during the attack. Mess attendants were not expected to do anything except survive. The official reports from the West Virginia mentioned unnamed sailors who had manned guns during the attack, but no names were recorded. The Navy was focused on damage assessment, casualty counts, and preparing for war. Individual acts of heroism by enlisted men, especially black enlisted men, were not a priority for documentation. Miller returned to regular duty assignments. He was reassigned to the USS Indianapolis in December of 1941. He went back to working as a mess attendant, serving food, cleaning quarters, doing laundry. The war continued. The Navy needed cooks more than it needed heroes. What neither Miller nor the Navy fully understood at the time was that the story of what happened on the West Virginia's bridge was spreading through unofficial channels. Sailors talk. Men who survived the attack told other sailors what they had seen. Someone had manned a machine gun on the West Virginia. Someone had fired at Japanese aircraft for 15 minutes without any training. Someone had helped move Captain Beenan. Someone had helped save wounded sailors. That someone was a mess attendant named Doris Miller. The story reached the black press by January of 1942. The Pittsburgh Courier started investigating. They wanted to know who this unnamed hero was. They wanted to know why the Navy had not identified him. They wanted to know why a black sailor who had fought back against the Japanese was being ignored by official reports. The Courier put pressure on the Navy. Other black newspapers joined in. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People got involved. Civil rights organizations demanded information. By March of 1942, the Navy finally confirmed the sailors' identity. Mess attendant second asked Doris Miller. The story exploded. Miller became famous overnight. The black community had a war hero. Someone who had proven that black sailors could fight. Someone who had shown courage under fire. Someone who had violated racist regulations to defend his ship and his country. The Navy faced a political problem. They had a genuine hero who had violated regulations. Miller had operated a weapon he was not authorized to use. He had acted outside his assigned role. By regulation, he should have faced discipline, but the public pressure was enormous. The black press was demanding recognition. Civil rights leaders were using Miller's story to push for desegregation of the military. White newspapers were picking up the story. Miller had become a symbol. The Navy made a decision. They would recognize Miller's actions with a commendation. On May 27, 1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, presented Miller with the Navy Cross. The ceremony took place on the flight deck of the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, anchored at Pearl Harbor. The Enterprise had been at sea during the Pearl Harbor attack, sparing her from the devastation. Now she was serving as the symbolic center of American naval power in the Pacific. Nimitz pinned the medal on Miller's uniform and said this marked the first time in the conflict that such high tribute had been made in the Pacific Fleet to a member of his race. The statement was both recognition and reminder. Recognition that Miller had earned the honor. Reminder that his race still mattered, still set him apart, still defined how the Navy saw him. The Navy Cross was the third highest decoration for combat valor. Only the Medal of Honor and the Navy Distinguished Service Medal ranked higher. At that time in 1942, the Navy Cross was actually the second highest award because Congress had not yet reorganized the precedence of decorations. That reorganization would come later in August of 1942. Miller was the first black sailor to receive the Navy Cross. The honor was genuine. The courage it recognized was real, but it also served the Navy's political needs. By honoring Miller publicly, the Navy could respond to pressure from civil rights organizations and the black press while still maintaining the segregated structure of naval service. Miller got his medal. He got promoted to mess attendant first class, but he was still a mess attendant. He was still restricted to non-combat ratings. The medal recognized what he had done. It did not change what he was allowed to do going forward. The ceremony was photographed. The images were distributed to newspapers across the country. Miller stood at attention. In his dress uniform, the Navy Cross ribbon bright against the white fabric. His posture was perfect, military bearing impeccable. He looked uncomfortable with the attention. His face showed none of the satisfaction or pride that might be expected. He looked like a man doing his duty while being photographed doing it. He had not joined the Navy to become famous. He had joined to earn money for his family. This fame, this attention, this ceremony, none of it was what he wanted, but it was what the moment required. The Navy promoted Miller to me. Attendant first class on June 1, 1942. Better pay, but still the same job. Cooking, serving, cleaning. The Navy was not ready to integrate combat roles. Not yet, but Miller had forced them to acknowledge that black sailors could fight. That acknowledgement was significant. It created pressure for change. In April of 1942, even before Miller officially received the Navy Cross, Secretary of the Navy William Franklin Knox announced the opening of an all-black naval training facility in Illinois. The Navy was beginning to crack open the door to integration. It was a small crack, but it existed. Miller's actions on December 7 had helped create that opening. In November of 1942, Miller was ordered back to the United States for a war bonds tour. The Navy wanted to use his story to sell bonds and encourage enlistment. Miller traveled to Oakland, California. He visited his hometown of Waco, Texas. He spoke in Dallas. He addressed the first graduating class of black sailors from Great Lakes Naval Training Station. He appeared on a 1943 Navy recruiting poster with the words "Above and Beyond the Call of Duty" printed below his photograph. The poster artist was David Stone Martin. The image showed Miller in his dress uniform looking directly at the viewer. It was used across the country to recruit black sailors into the Navy. Miller gave speeches at war bond rallies. He shook hands with civilians. He posed for photographs. He answered the same questions over and over. What was it like? Were you scared? How did you know how to fire the gun? Miller's responses were typically brief. He said it was not hard. He just pulled the trigger and the gun worked fine. He had watched other sailors with the guns during training. He thought he got one of the Japanese planes. They were diving pretty close. Miller did not elaborate much beyond those basic facts. He was not comfortable being a public speaker. He was a cook who had done what needed to be done. He did not see himself as special. But the Navy and the country needed him to be special. They needed a symbol. Miller filled that role even though he would have preferred to avoid it. In February of 1943, the Navy changed the mess attendant rating title to steward's mate. A cosmetic change, but it indicated some movement toward recognizing the dignity of black sailors. The job was still the same, the segregation was still in place, but the language was shifting. Miller completed his war bonds tour and requested assignment back to a combat vessel. The Navy sent him to Puget Sound Navy Yard in Breton, Washington in May of 1943. He was assigned to the newly constructed escort carrier Liscum Bay, designated QF-56. The ship was 512 feet long with a beam of 65 feet. She displaced 818 tons. Twin reciprocating steam engines gave her a top speed of 19 knots. The flight deck was 477 feet long. The hangar deck could hold approximately 28 aircraft depending on configuration. Liscum Bay was one of 50 Casablanca-class escort carriers being built rapidly to support the Pacific Campaign. These ships were not meant to engage in fleet actions like the big fleet carriers. They provided air support for amphibious landings, convoy escort, and aircraft ferry service. The crew numbered 960 men. Miller was promoted to cook third class on June 1, 1943. Better pay again, still cooking. He worked in the galley preparing meals for officers and crew. The Liscum Bay completed shakedown exercises and departed for Pearl Harbor on October 22, 1943. The ship trained in Hawaiian waters for several weeks, then left Pearl Harbor on November 10, 1943 to join Task Force 52. The target was the Gilbert Islands, specifically Macon. The invasion code named Operation Galvanic began on November 20, 1943. It was the first major American offensive in the Central Pacific. The Liscum Bay provided air support for ground forces attacking Macon Island. The carrier launched aircraft to provide close air support, conduct reconnaissance, and attack Japanese positions. The operation was going well. American forces were securing the islands. The Japanese garrison on Macon was nearly eliminated. The invasion was succeeding, but the Japanese submarine I-175 was prowling the waters near Macon. The submarine was commanded by Lieutenant Commander Sunso Tabata. He had arrived in the area on the night of November 23, 1943. He positioned his submarine outside the destroyer screen, protecting the American carriers. On the morning of November 24, 1943, Réveil sounded aboard Liscum Bay at 4:30. Miller woke up, dressed, and reported to the galley to begin preparing breakfast. The ship's routine was normal. Aircraft were being prepared for the day's operations. Flight crews were checking their planes. The hangar deck was busy. 13 aircraft were positioned on the flight deck, fueled and armed. 7 more were in the hangar, not yet fueled. At 0505, the ship went to routine general quarters as flight crews prepared for dawn launching. This was standard procedure. Miller was likely at his battle station. Navy records suggest he was assigned to a 20mm anti-aircraft gun on the starboard side somewhere between frames 155 and 145. The carrier was steaming northeast at about 15 knots. Liscum Bay was positioned in a way that presented her broadside to the area where I-175 was lurking. At 0510, a lookout on Liscum Bay spotted a torpedo wake heading toward the ship. He shouted a warning. The white trail of bubbles in the water was unmistakable. Torpedo inbound, starboard side. But the torpedo was too close and moving too fast. There was no time to maneuver, no time to change course, no time to do anything except brace for impact. It was too late. The torpedo struck Liscum Bay just after of the engine room on the starboard side at 0513. The impact felt like the ship had hit a wall at full speed. Then came the explosion. The Type 95 torpedo carried 490 kilograms of high explosive. The blast opened a hole in the carrier's hull and sent a shock wave through the entire ship. But that was just the beginning. The torpedo had struck directly adjacent to the aviation bomb storage magazine. The bombs stored there were armed and ready for the day's operations. 500-pound bombs, 1,000-pound bombs, all packed with high explosive. The torpedo detonation triggered a sympathetic explosion in the bomb magazine. The secondary explosion was catastrophic. It was exponentially more powerful than the torpedo itself. The blast ripped through the carrier from bottom to top. The force blew out entire sections of the hull. The flight deck bulged upward and then tore open. A massive fireball erupted through the opening, shooting flames and debris hundreds of feet into the air. The explosion was visible from ships 10 miles away. Shrapnel was thrown outward in all directions, some pieces traveling more than 5,000 yards. Chunks of the ship, pieces of aircraft, fragments of equipment, all became projectiles. Debris rained down on nearby ships. The USS New Mexico, a battleship in the task force steaming about 1,500 yards away, was hit by falling wreckage from Lisk Bay. Pieces of metal crashed onto New Mexico's deck. Some of the debris was recognizable as parts of aircraft. Some was unidentifiable twisted metal. The explosion killed everyone in the aft section of the ship instantly. Anyone in or near the bomb magazines simply ceased to exist. The blast vaporized them. Anyone in adjacent compartments died from the concussion, the flashfire or flying debris. The forward hangar deck was consumed by fire. Aviation fuel from aircraft fuel tanks ignited. The fire spread through the hangar in seconds. Aircraft on the flight deck were thrown into the air by the blast or ignited by the flames that followed. Some planes were tossed overboard intact. Others broke apart. One Grumman Wildcat fighter was found floating in the water a mile from where Lisk Bay sank. Fuel and ammunition stored in the hangar began cooking off. Secondary explosions ripped through what remained of the ship. 500 lb bombs detonated. 50 caliber ammunition belts cooked off. Fuel tanks ruptured and caught fire. The explosion killed everyone in the aft section of the ship instantly. The forward hangar deck was consumed by fire. Aircraft on the flight deck were thrown into the air or ignited by the flames. Fuel and ammunition stored in the hangar began cooking off. Secondary explosions ripped through what remained of the ship. Power failed immediately. Water mains broke. The ship began listing to starboard. Fires spread rapidly. The flight deck buckled and twisted from the heat and structural damage. Within minutes, Lisk Bay was clearly doomed. Men who survived the initial explosion tried to reach the main deck. Many were trapped by fire and flooding. Others were injured and could not move. The surviving crew began abandoning ship. Men jumped into the water from the tilted deck. The ocean was covered with burning fuel oil. Swimmers had to navigate between patches of fire. Some men had life jackets, others did not. At 0533, exactly 23 minutes after the torpedo hit, Lisk Bay rolled to starboard and sank. She went down stern first. The bow lifted out of the water briefly, then the entire ship disappeared beneath the surface. 642 men died in the explosion and sinking. That included Captain Irving Wiltsey, Rear Admiral Henry Molan, who commanded Carrier Division 24, and Cook Third Class Doris Miller. Destroyers from the task force rushed to the site to pick up survivors. USS Morris, USS Hughes, USS Hull, USS Madonna. They pulled men from the water. Many were already dead from burns, drowning, or injuries. Others died despite rescue efforts. The destroyers recovered 272 survivors total. The rescue operations were dangerous. Japanese submarine I-175 was still in the area. The destroyers conducted depth charge attacks while attempting rescue operations. They detected what might have been the submarine on sonar and dropped charges. Whether they hit anything was unclear at the time. The survivors were transferred to other ships in the task force and taken to Hawaii for medical treatment. The bodies of sailors who died during rescue operations were buried at sea. Most of the crew lost on Leescam Bay were never recovered. They went down with the ship. Miller was listed as missing in action, presumed dead. His body was never found. The Navy notified his parents on December 7, 1943. Exactly 2 years after Pearl Harbor, Connery and Henrietta Miller received a telegram informing them their son was gone. He was 24 years old. The Navy awarded Miller a Purple Heart posthumously. He already had the Navy Cross. He had battle stars for his service, but the recognition felt hollow to many who knew his story. Miller had proven himself twice, once at Pearl Harbor, once in the 2 years of service that followed. He had fought back when he was not supposed to fight. He had served with distinction, despite a system designed to limit him. He had become a symbol for Black Americans pushing for equality in the military and in society, and then he was gone. The Japanese submarine I-175 continued operating in the Pacific after sinking Lisk Combat. Lieutenant Commander Tabata took his submarine back to Japanese waters, but the submarine's luck ran out. On February 4, 1944, I-175 was operating near Kwajalein Atoll during the American invasion there. The destroyer USS Chariot and the destroyer escort USS Fair detected the submarine. Using sonar, they attacked with Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars. The weapons hit their target. I-175 was sunk with all hands. Tabata and his crew died. The submarine that killed Miller and over 600 other American sailors was destroyed. Miller's story did not end with his death. In many ways, it was just beginning to have its full impact. The Navy had reluctantly recognized Miller during his life. After his death, his story became even more powerful as a symbol of the need for change. The black press continued to write about Miller. They used his story to push for full desegregation of the military. Civil rights organizations pointed to Miller as proof that segregation was both immoral and impractical. If a black cook could man an anti-aircraft gun effectively with no training, what did that say about the Navy's claims that black sailors were not capable of combat roles? Miller had demolished that argument simply by doing what needed to be done. His actions raised uncomfortable questions for military leadership. How many other capable men were being wasted in mess halls when they could be fighting? How much combat effectiveness was the military sacrificing to maintain racial segregation? How could the United States claim to be fighting for freedom abroad while denying it to its own citizens at home? The Navy slowly began to change. In 1944, the Navy started accepting black sailors for general service ratings, not just steward positions. This was a significant shift. Black sailors could now train as gunners, mates, radiomen, quartermasters, and other technical ratings. They were still segregated in many ways, still faced discrimination and barriers, but the absolute prohibition on combat training had been breached. In 1945, the Navy commissioned its first black officers. 12 men became NEENs after graduating from Officer Candidate School. This was another crack in the wall of segregation. Black men were now leading other sailors, including white sailors. In some cases, the changes were slow. They were insufficient. They were often undermined by officers who opposed integration. But they were happening. Miller's sacrifice and the sacrifices of thousands of other black servicemen created pressure that could not be ignored. In July of 1948, President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 9981, mandating desegregation of the armed forces. The order stated that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. The order did not immediately integrate every unit. Implementation took years. Some branches resisted more than others, but the legal foundation for desegregation had been established. The process took years to complete fully, but the foundation had been laid. Miller's actions on December 7, 1941 had been part of that foundation. Not the only part, not even the most important part in terms of policy changes, but a visible, undeniable, emotionally powerful part. When Americans thought about racial integration in the military, many thought about Dory Miller manning that gun at Pearl Harbor. That image, that story, that moment became a touchstone in the larger struggle for civil rights. In 1973, the Navy commissioned the frigate USS Miller, hull number F-1091. Named in honor of Doris Miller. The ship was a Knox-class frigate 438 feet long. Commissioned at Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Port South, Virginia, she served in the Atlantic Fleet and Mediterranean, participating in numerous operations during the Cold War. The Miller was decommissioned in 1991 after 18 years of the service. In 1991, a bronze commemorative plaque was dedicated at Doris Miller Park, a housing community near Naval Station Pearl Harbor. The dedication was organized by Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority and took place on October 12, 1991, which would have been Miller's 72nd birthday. In 2001, the film Pearl Harbor included a depiction of Miller's actions during the attack. Actor Cuba Gooding Jr. played Miller in the movie. The scene showed Miller manning the gun and firing at Japanese aircraft. The film took some historical liberties with details, but it brought Miller's story to a new generation of Americans who might not have known about him. In 2010, the United States Postal Service honored Miller as one of 4 distinguished sailors on a commemorative stamp. The stamp showed Miller in his naval uniform wearing his Navy Cross. In 2014, the Department of Veterans Affairs named its medical center in 128 Waco, Texas, after Doris Miller. The Doris Miller VA Medical Center serves veterans in Central Texas. The facility includes inpatient and outpatient services representing a permanent tribute to Miller in his hometown. In 2017, a 9ft bronze statue of Miller was unveiled in Waco on December 7, the 76th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. The statue stands on the banks of the Brazos River. It shows Miller in his uniform looking out across the water. The memorial includes plaques describing his actions at Pearl Harbor. On January 20, 2020, Acting Secretary of the Navy Thomas Miley announced that the Navy would name its next aircraft carrier after Doris Miller. The ship would be designated CVN-81, a Gerald Ford-class nuclear-powered supercarrier. Construction began in 2024. The ship is scheduled for commissioning around 2032. When complete, USS Doris Miller will be one of the most powerful warships ever built. Over 1,000 feet long, nuclear-powered, capable of carrying 75 aircraft. A crew of approximately 4,500 sailors. The ship will serve for 50 years or more. This is an extraordinary honor. Aircraft carriers are typically named for presidents, members of Congress, or 4-star admirals. Miller was an enlisted cook who served for 4 years, but his impact on the Navy and on American society earned him this recognition. What makes Miller's story remarkable is not just what he did on December 7, 1941. It is what his actions represented and what they set in motion. Miller was a man confined within a system that insisted he was unfit to fight. The Navy dictated that black sailors could cook and clean but could not operate weapons. That was the official policy, codified in regulations, upheld by tradition, defended by officers who genuinely believed black men were incapable of combat duty. Miller disproved them in 15 minutes of relentless fire against enemy aircraft. He disproved them by helping move his mortally wounded captain to safety. He disproved them by aiding other sailors as his ship sank. He disproved them by surviving and continuing to serve. And he disproved them by returning to combat, even when he had every reason to leave the military and never look back. Miller understood the Navy was unjust. He understood the system was designed to confine him to a subordinate role, yet he served anyway because his country was at war, and he believed in fulfilling his duty. This kind of bravery differs from courage under fire. It is the courage to confront a system while simultaneously defending it. Miller fought both the Japanese and American racism. He won some battles and lost others, but he never ceased fighting. The United States military evolved because of men like Miller, not quickly, not easily, but inevitably. When a cook can operate an anti-aircraft gun effectively with no formal training, the fiction that combat roles should be segregated by race becomes untenable. When a sailor earns the Navy Cross and returns to regular duties without complaint, the fiction that recognition and promotion should be constrained by skin color cannot stand. When a man becomes a national hero and uses that platform to advocate for equality, the fiction that separate can be equal collapses. Miller accomplished all of these feats. He did them without asking for permission. He did them because they were necessary. And in doing so, he helped dismantle a system that had persisted for generations. The Navy that commissioned the USS Doris Miller in 2020 is not the Navy that told Miller he could only be a cook in 1939. That transformation occurred because of countless individuals who fought for it, and Miller was one of them. His 15 minutes manning a gun on December 7, 1941, resonated for decades afterward. Miller's parents, Connery and Henrietta, lived the rest of their lives knowing their son had died serving his nation. They preserved his medals in photographs. They attended memorials. They spoke occasionally to journalists about their son. They were proud of his accomplishments and heartbroken that he was gone. Miller's siblings carried his legacy. His brothers served in World War II, and one brother was also named Doris, the family nickname somehow passing to the younger sibling. The Miller family remained in Texas, witnessing their son's name gain national recognition. They saw his image on recruiting posters, read newspaper articles about him, and received letters from admirers. Yet they never regained their son. He was lost somewhere in the Pacific when the USS Liscum Bay sank. No grave to visit, no body to bury, only memories, medals, and the knowledge that Doris had done something extraordinary. The Navy later concluded that Miller had likely been at his battle station when the torpedo struck. If he had been manning the starboard 20mm gun, he would have been very close to the impact point. The explosion would have killed him instantly. He probably never knew what struck him. That is a small consolation. He did not suffer. He did not burn. He did not drown. One moment he was alive, the next he was gone. Hundreds of others on Liscum Bay did suffer. They burned in fires, drowned in oil-covered water, or slowly succumbed to injuries. In that respect, Miller was fortunate. His death was swift. What would Miller have thought about the aircraft carrier USS Doris Miller? It is impossible to know. He did not seek fame. He did not join the Navy for glory. He did not man that gun at Pearl Harbor for recognition. He acted because Japanese aircraft were attacking his ship and someone needed to fight back. The gun was there. He understood the basics, so he used it. That was Miller's approach to everything. See what needed to be done, do it, without waiting for permission or worrying about regulations. That approach earned him the Navy Cross. That approach helped change the United States Navy. That approach made him a civil rights symbol. And that approach explains why, decades after his death, the Navy chose to name a supercarrier after a cook from Waco, Texas, who had the courage to fight back when he was told he should not fight at all. If you found this story compelling, take a moment to like this video. It helps share more stories about individuals whose bravery altered history. Subscribe to stay connected. These stories matter. They demonstrate that heroism often emerges from unexpected places and that one person's actions can ripple through time in ways they never imagined. Leave a comment sharing where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans to students to history enthusiasts. You all help preserve these memories. Thank you for watching, thank you for remembering, and thank you for understanding that Miller's fight is not over. The battle for equality, recognition, and justice continues. Miller would probably tell us to stop talking about him and get to work. Let us honor him by doing exactly that.